Lifting homes has become a booming business in coastal Florida. Homeowners responding to rising seas by raising their homes. Here to discuss it is Jessica Beach, Chief Resilience Officer and Deputy Director of Public Works and Utilities for the City of St. Augustine. Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning. How are you, Ann?
Very well. Thanks for being here. We're also
Sure.
joined by Buddy Schauland, Building Official and Code Enforcement Manager for the City of St. Augustine. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Um, Jessica, it's possible now to drive around St. Augustine and sort of see the visual manifestation of climate change in a couple of ways. The city's doing a lot of efforts. There's a lot of construction projects that you'll see, but one of the most striking is this home lifting. They're lifted off their elevation, and it is something that we're seeing just a lot more of than even just a few years ago. Can you just kind of describe this situation in St. Augustine, how much of that you're seeing, what it aims to accomplish?
Sure. So I would say Hurricane Matthew in 2016 really hit the city of St. Augustine hard. And I know Buddy at the time, he was our, still is our building official, and he can definitely speak to what he has seen firsthand with our homes being totally impacted, businesses, just the quality of life. It's been pretty devastating for the community. And so I think that wake up call from Hurricane Matthew really kind of set in motion a number of initiatives that the city's been undertaking. But not only that, just our community. I think just seeing the resilience of our community has been inspiring. And a lot of the folks have, out of their own fruition, this is not any state program or city program or federal program. They've been doing it kind of outside of that in a lot of ways. And so I think you've seen the city transform a lot of houses that maybe have been repetitively flooded. Some have lifted, some have been demolished, and then someone will come in and buy that and build like new construction. So you'll see it kind of throughout the city. It's like checkered. And what makes our city a little bit unique is we have a lot of historic properties. And so that's brought another set of challenges. And we actually have flooding guidance for properties that are historic, and it can really apply to any type of property in general. But there are, tricks of the trade, so to speak, to help those historic properties kind of blend in, because that does become, when you're looking at the landscape or the streetscape, it does change how houses look on some of our historic streets.
Sure. And I know that we've got some photos of these buildings around St. Augustine that people who are watching our live stream will be able to look at that show. It can, Buddy, be a little peculiar. Sometimes it's subtle and it's just a couple feet that these homes are being lifted, but sometimes it's really quite dramatic, especially when you're taking a slab home and lifting it 10 or more feet.
Yeah, the majority of the homes that are being lifted for us, though, they're on piers, so it's easier to lift them. But a lot of them are lifting them up, and they're wanting to have storage or vehicle parking underneath it, so they're lifting them up even higher because of that.
Yeah. And it's not a project for the faint of heart. I mean, describe how it's done if it is a slab home, because there's so many of those. I'm thinking particularly in the Davis Shores neighborhood, and you're seeing even those homes being, with hydraulic jacks, I guess, lifted up.
Well, we haven't had any within the city that were on slab being elevated. A lot of those, what they've done, and these are all out of their own pocket, they are abandoning the first floor and they're building up from there. A lot of them, they'll take off the roof and then they'll start building up and then fill in up to the height that they want to put a slab in there. And so they're still using the existing structure, but just building it up higher.
I'm curious about that. I'm going to ask my director if he can find a particular photo of a blue house. I think it's got some yellow chairs, and it may take him a minute to pull it up. But when he does, I want to ask about it because I'm fairly certain that was a raised slab. I mean, perhaps the slab is intact on the bottom, and they've raised it and built a new floor.
They've done, actually, our director, she lives over in Volano, on Volano Beach, and a neighbor of hers, they lifted a slab. They dig underneath it and they put the beams underneath there, and then they start jacking it up. And so you have the whole slab and the whole house that's been
This
jacked up.
house there. Do you
I think
think that
that's in
was?
South Davis Shores, that particular house.
I mean,
Yeah.
I seem to recall when that was in the works of being lifted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you'll see it throughout the neighborhood too. A lot of the houses have been doing it. It's been, so the story on that too is we had mentioned Hurricane Matthew 2016, a lot of flooding. We had Hurricane Irma 11 months later, 2017. So you've got houses that were just getting put back together. They weren't even talking about lifting, just getting it back to the way it was, and then another hurricane comes and floods it. That's really, I think, a trigger where some people were trying to look for other alternatives to try to save their homes. And so that lifting really became evident. And then I think also, I think it was in 2020, we had kind of this compound flood event. It wasn't a hurricane, but it was a nor'easter during king tide season, and we literally had citywide flooding, almost like a Hurricane Dorian type level. But
Mhm.
this wasn't on anyone's radar. It just kind of came out of nowhere. All these conditions kind of combined, and so I remember Buddy and I were at a neighborhood meeting, and we had our city manager, a lot of city staff, and our residents came out. They were like, "We need something." There is a program that's actually where we launched a formal kind of participation in the flood mitigation assistance program, where FEMA has the ability to come in and cost share with property owners to lift. There's a lot of rules and things that you have to do to follow the FEMA requirements, but that's really what triggered it. And so actually, Buddy piloted that project with two properties that we knew wanted to do something, and so we put in I say we, Buddy, put in the hard work of those applications to submit to FEMA to kind of pilot it. It's pretty involved. So we ended up a year later in 2021, we had a consulting team come on board to help the city with it. So we've been participating in FEMA's flood mitigation assistance program since 2021, where we're taking applications through our community, putting them together, submitting to FEMA, and we're trying to get those through that process so eventually they can cost share with the federal government to be able to lift on that too. And we've talked with contractors. There's some local contractors that do it. It's kind of a niche industry, and it's very specialized, and but it's throughout the entire state. You're seeing more of that need as people want to stay in their homes, they want to stay in their community, and this is one way to do that.
And how receptive is FEMA, Buddy, to these kinds of applications versus other FEMA resilience programs where they offer some sort of reimbursement? Is home raising something that they're very enthusiastic about generally?
Yeah, it's the flood mitigation assistance grant. And they've been having it around for years now, and it's an annual one. And they're promoting elevating or demolish and rebuild, or even where the jurisdiction acquires the property as an acquisition. Then you can make it into a park. You can never build anything on it again. They've been very receptive with it. They've been pushing it a lot. And then a few years ago, when we had that big infrastructure bill that President Biden signed, it dumped a bunch of money into the program so that more people can have more stuff done, more dealing with their houses.
Right. And what kind of demand have you seen from your community when it comes to these FEMA applications?
We started the first year, like Jessica was saying, was I had two property owners approach me about it. I'd been talking about it since Hurricane Matthew in 2016, but it's a time-consuming process. And earlier, you did have the picture of the one that we have from the 2020 cycle that is being built. But that year, we had two property owners. I went through the process, and FDM, Florida Department of Emergency Management, they were very helpful because I didn't know how to do any of this stuff, and they helped me through it. They only recommended one of the two. And it comes down to a benefit cost analysis and whether it's profitable for FEMA to fund this.
Mhm.
They look at, I think it's 30 years worth of possible flooding and what they would have to pay out. Is it worth it for them to do it? The one they didn't, the state said, yeah, FEMA's not going to ever do that one. But then the other one, they said they would do it. And that was a demolition and reconstruction of a new structure. And I'll say we started that process in 2020, and the house isn't done yet. It's almost done.
Wow.
So,
It's a marathon.
yeah,
The program is a marathon. And you had mentioned like the interest. So we piloted it in 2020. 2021, we had, I think, about 20 plus properties that went in and submitted. There wasn't enough funding in the program at the time, so we did not get those properties funded. But as Buddy had alluded to, they did pump more money into that program. So in 2022, we applied again, and we had actually in 2022, we also had Hurricanes Ian and Nicole hit. So we had initially the 20 properties that were carried forward from the 2021 cycle. And then we had over 80 properties come to us after that hurricane because we were literally in the middle of the cycle, the application cycle for that. So there was a huge demand. And at the end of the day, we have 60 properties that have made it through. And we're pretty close towards the end of actually getting contracts awarded from FEMA. At least we're hopeful. We're kind of seeing to see what happens with that too. But we have 60 properties in the queue. In 2023, we had, I think, it's about 10 properties that made it through. And now in 2024, we just turned stuff into the state. So we're going to see how many properties with that. So it's been a very program of interest, but it's a commitment. It takes time, and it's cost shared. So the homeowner, in a lot of cases, is having to come up with their 25% of the cost it's going to take it to lift, and FEMA will cover 75%. And there is a tiered cost sharing ability with FEMA. So they want to target the severe repetitive loss properties first. Those are like the most severely damaged that they want to lift first. Those get higher priority
The ones that
typically.
have flooded repeatedly.
Yes, and there's a whole formula. Buddy knows that much better than I
Yeah.
do, but there's a formula to how they calculate that. So there is a cost sharing percentage and prioritization through that program. So it's, a lot of people can apply for it, but it really depends on, there's other factors that go into that.
I want to talk more about cost, but first, if you're just joining us, we are talking about resilience efforts in St. Augustine, some of which include raising existing properties. If you have a question or a comment, please give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. So let's talk cost. There was a recent story, relatively recent, in the New York Times talking about some homes that were being lifted in Florida, also homes that were being lifted in Texas following Hurricane Harvey and all the damage that wrought. And their costs were roughly in the area of about $75 to $200 a square foot to lift. They were saying a typical Florida home on a slab could cost as much as $400,000 to raise, but larger houses could easily exceed $1 million. So, how does FEMA calculate the cost benefit analysis? It is based just on the cost of repairing should it flood?
It's complicated. That's why we have a consulting firm help us with that to navigate that process with it. I do remember kind of on average. So again, keeping in mind, if like using the fiscal year 2022 as an example, if we had 60 properties. I think we did like a quick average. It was around $200,000 on average per property to lift. But keep in mind, you have some that were maybe 75,000. You had some that could be 400,000 to 600,000. Like it ranges, and a lot of it depends on the structure. And Buddy's more familiar with that side of it too. But that kind of gives at least a number in people's minds to be able to understand, like, what does it cost to do this? But we have seen those costs going up every year. So that was, from a few years ago.
Sure.
So it's expensive in some ways, but if you can cost share with that, I think that's the incentive why folks are interested in this federal program, to be able to make that more attainable.
The article that I was talking about, Buddy, they said, it can be hard for some homeowners to wrap their heads around it. They had one couple in, I think it was in St. Petersburg, that initially bought their home for $265,000. And when they looked at raising it, it was going to cost $375,000. And they initially resisted because they said it's just not worth it. And then their home flooded twice. And so now they're doing it.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest problems is you got to factor in how much it's going to cost to do all this, and how much is your mortgage? How much did you just buy the house? Are you upside down on it still because of all that? And then you want to put more money into it. And if you're looking at, I want to do a demolition and reconstruction of something, you're demolishing something, your house, that I'm pretty sure the bank probably is not going to be happy about you doing that. But you got to get more money to be able to do all of this. So they have to weigh it. And we saw a lot of people that didn't want to do it because of the cost. But after they keep getting flooded every year because of hurricanes, a lot of them are just being driven to have to do something or try to sell the property and hopefully get something out of it.
What about the character of the neighborhood? I mean, we're talking about Davis Shores in some of these pictures that we've been looking at, and those homes are, some of them are historic. The neighborhood itself certainly is a historic plat, but it's not kind of what people think about as colonial St. Augustine historic. There are homes in that area, though, that have also been raised along the bayfront that are historic
Mhm.
homes. So, what does it do to the fabric of a neighborhood when people start raising the homes up?
That's one of the things that the Historic Architectural Review Board, if you want to raise your house, you have to go to them to get permission because it's a partial demolition of the structure, and they'll generally let you do it. But they struggled at the beginning when people started wanting to elevate it because it changes the streetscape of all these buildings have always been this high, and now you're starting to elevate some of them. And I remember one that they did they were raising it, and there's the house next door when they came. This house had already been raised, and they were still working on it. That next house, they wanted to go way higher, and they went to the board, and the board struggled with that because they know FEMA wants you to get higher. They want them to get higher, but it would look really bad it wouldn't look proportionally correct.
Mm.
And so they allowed them to go just as high as what the other one did. If they went up 4 feet, then they could go up 4 feet. So it is a struggle when you're talking about the actual historic districts and trying to get these properties elevated.
Yeah.
We had a resilient heritage study that came out in 2021 that looked at the economics of flooding and how it impacts our historic city. And out of that also stemmed that flooding guidance for historic properties. And there's a lot of resources in there, and it's how do you kind of make the view shed more integrated with the adjacent properties. And so there's ways that you can do that. And there's examples in the guidebook too that show how you can get creative with the latticing and kind of hiding some of where the lifting is. And you'll see that along the bayfront,
Mhm.
examples of that. And that's part of a walking tour that we do too, just to show like this is happening. And to Buddy's point too, our historic architectural review board kind of struggles with that because it does change the streetscape quite a bit, but it's almost a domino effect because as these properties are starting to lift, they're trying to become more resilient and protect those historic properties. But then there's cases where buildings cannot be lifted because of various structural reasons. Then they have to look at floodproofing those buildings. And so that, again, they're going to be sitting at that elevation that they're at now. They can't lift. So it does kind of change the way things look for the historic city.
Yeah, and certainly some homes, I mean, the kind of traditional Florida cinder block home, when it's lifted up, 10, 15 feet, it has a peculiar look. I mean, it's got this staircase that's desperately trying to reach the front door, and it looks kind of out of the aspect ratio that you prefer, I guess, of just a house, how it looks.
And you'll see that kind of transitioning in South Davis Shores. I know some of the photos that we're kind of running through as examples of that too, is you're seeing more of it through the neighborhood because these houses, they were built like in the 1950s, I think. And so this was before flood insurance rate maps were created and before we really understood and knew what a floodplain was. And so it's definitely kind of it's transforming the neighborhood.
Sure. I mean, places like Davis Shores too, I guess they're almost created out of marsh, right? They were just
Yes.
filled essentially marshlands that it's really not that surprising that there is this particular peril. But I wanted to ask you because I know that there's some, I mean, you can raise a home, but you are also over public works and utilities, and there are a lot of things that cannot be raised or are not being
Mhm.
raised when it comes to, obviously streets can be underwater, sewer systems can be underwater,
Mhm.
and so if your home is high and dry, it doesn't matter if you can't get to it or if you can't use the facilities.
That is part of the trade-off, and so the home raising is one tool in the toolbox to try to help protect those assets from, like, a homeowner's perspective. On the city side of it, when we're looking at critical infrastructure, we went through and just completed a vulnerability assessment looking at where should we be prioritizing our critical assets, and so for a homeowner and we've talked about this with our community, in some cases, roads may not be able to be raised. It's a very costly process and we'd have to look at that kind of comprehensively to see does it make sense to do that. So there is that trade-off of kind of living with the floods even though your asset, your properties may be out of that harm's way when it comes to floodwaters, but there could be other services impacted. And I will say the city has been targeting like our sewer system because we were significantly impacted under Hurricane Matthew and we had damages to our lift stations, which moves the sewer water from your home to the wastewater treatment plant. And so when those get knocked out, you're not able to flush your toilets. That's not good. So we just recently wrapped up a project hardening and elevating and flood proofing those critical infrastructure that can help those toilets keep flushing and get to the wastewater treatment plant. So the city is taking measures where it can to do that. But to your point, it's trade offs with there's things that can be done, but it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, and there are also some properties, but you'd mentioned you can in some cases, FEMA will support the city acquiring the land if it's a willing seller and just saying, "We're never gonna build on it again," and you have done that in St. Augustine. Some properties, I know there's a park kind of in the same neighborhood.
Yeah, we that wasn't done through FEMA. It was
Okay.
the city, commission just we ended up buying it, and they moved the house and moved over down towards, Palm Coast, and then we turned it into a park. We brought in Phil and put it into a park to try to, buffer the water coming in.
Yeah. The question of fill is also something that is on your radar right now. I know that there's been a lot of discussion in the city about people who are trying to harden their property by bringing in additional fill. Can you describe, first of all, what they're trying to accomplish and why that sometimes is a problem?
I was like, who takes this one?
Yeah. So, when you build a new house, you're required to be at a certain height. You gotta be 1 foot above what the base flood elevation is, and everybody wants to get as high as they can get. You do have uh, zoning ordinances that says your roof can only be so high, and that goes off of that 1 foot freeboard. They're 1 foot above the base flood elevation is where it starts measuring from. But people are trying to get as high as they can, and a lot of people want to have a slab on grade house, and they want to have that fill brought in there. And so people have been bringing in a lot of fill. It hasn't been that big of an issue up until more recently, probably last year and a half ago, where people are bringing in a lot of fill, and what it's doing is it's causing problems with the neighbors. The one where it became a real big issue, where the planning and zoning board is starting to kind of freak out about it and stuff. But they built walls on the side, and then they brought in all this fill, and the finished floor for the house that's going to go there is going to be at the roof line of the neighbor's house.
Where is that located?
It's in South Davis Shores, off of just down from Coquina Park on Coquina Avenue.
Okay.
Yeah,
And so
the house that's right next to the Coquina Park is in between these two. They flood for everything. Every
Mhm.
time there's any water that comes into South Davis Shores, they're flooding. So they're afraid that this is going to cause more flooding for them.
Because it's a kind of a runoff situation, or just not equity in terms of where the water goes?
I think it's a combination. So the city actually had a task force put together. I think it was in 2021 when we kicked that off, and it was starting to address that fill issue because it was particularly in South Davis Shores where you're seeing the houses going up. And to Buddy was describing one of those scenarios where one house is coming in to bring in fill and one is hasn't done that yet, and so it's a perception is part of that. Just looking physically at a much higher building. And also, the task force was trying to tackle that. So they did a couple of things out of it. They capped what we call impervious area. So you can't just pave over your entire lot. They're trying to leave some of that for percolation for rainwater to go in. But also, we have a lot grading requirement now. And this is particularly for single family lots to help manage that rainwater. So there are different types of flooding. And I think that's where people struggle. You've got the coastal tides and that aspect coming in flooding, but then you have when it just rains. And so this is mainly trying to manage rainwater that's hitting that property so it's not just flooding out their neighbors. And so there's ways to do that. We have some guidance out there, and it's best practices where they can try to retain their rainwater and not flood their neighbors out. So it's like more of an intentional thing that they can do with that. So it's been a challenge.
Yeah. Is there a sense that the city will be evaluating the value of rebuilding some homes? And what does the city have in its pocket when it comes to, trying to encourage a homeowner that has repeatedly flooded, perhaps try to persuade them to move?
I think it's been kind of more on the property owners, like, it's just kind of happened as Buddy had mentioned earlier too, everyone's in a different circumstance and situations. You have some younger families coming to the neighborhood that would like to stay long term, but then we also have others that are, retired or on fixed income, they have nowhere else to go. And so you have kind of across the board different situations on it. So as the city, we're basically trying to connect people to resources and what their options are and let them kind of make that decision for themselves. I would say most of the homeowners that we've met with, we do a lot of one-on-one site visits because a lot of questions that we get on flooding and flood mitigation. We'll meet with homeowners on their property and kind of give them some ideas. There's checklists and tools and resources that we can connect them with to kind of empower them to be able to do what they can on their property. And as we meet with individuals and talk with them, most people, they love the neighborhood, they love the city, they want to stay. And so they're doing whatever they can possible to make that happen. And so there has been cases where people they don't want to deal with the flooding. It can be very stressful, and they sell and they'll move out. But then you still have some that are this is where they want to stay. So we've seen kind of across the board with that.
What are some of the things that you can advise people if you're visiting their property and they're not in a position or, financially able to raise their house, that they can do that might alleviate some of those floodwaters?
We talked to them about trying to flood proof the house as best they can. FEMA doesn't recognize it, so you can't get any discounts on your insurance if you flood proof.
What does it mean to floodproof your home?
You're putting in door dams that will try to block the water from coming in. You're putting paint or something, a special type of paint or a special type of barrier on the outside up so far that it won't let the water penetrate into the house. Just doing things like that to try to keep the water from entering your house. FEMA doesn't recognize that for residential properties, but it could, if you can't afford to elevate or demolish and tear and build a new house, these are some of the things that we're trying to tell them to do to try to help with that. Also, if they can figure out ways to, in their landscaping, to try to keep the water from coming in. We have had some people down on St. George Street that have 3 houses that got together and they put a wall around all 3 houses, and then they put these door dams, in the openings whenever there's a hurricane coming or we know
Mhm.
about any flooding. They put them in there, and so far they've protected those houses from any water getting in there.
I've been kind of collecting those examples as we meet with homeowners, and it's amazing to see the resilience, I think, of our community. They are doing whatever they can to try to floodproof it. So the landscaping is one option where they can look at ways to try to keep the water from just kind of rushing into their house. We've seen homeowners come in and just the first thing is just elevating electrical features like the mechanical equipment that they don't want to get flooded. So their AC
Putting your
units
air
and things like
conditioning
that.
up, yeah.
Exactly. Get those up high. The door dams that Buddy had mentioned, those have been really popular. I remember this past hurricane season when we were getting ready for, I think it was Hurricane Milton, everyone had those out. And so we're seeing more of these products come online for both the businesses, but particularly with the residents. And so it's almost like a process where, they flood, they put it back together as it was, they flood again. They're like, I'm going to get a little bit smarter this time and try to flood proof it. And then at some point, that decision about lifting is kind of where they land to decide if they want to make that investment. The walls have been much more popular lately. We've been seeing more people coming in for walls to protect the property. It's essentially what they call like a ring wall system, where they come in and they're basically building a mini wall around their property, and they have to have pump systems on the backside in case the water gets over the wall. They have to have a way for the water to get out. So there's different levels of sophistication and costs associated with those too. But we've been seeing our community kind of get very creative with this.
What about building back with materials? I mean, I think of things like laminate flooring, which I have in my house, and drywall, which
Mhm.
are affordable but aren't very flood resistant. Do you advise people if they've flooded or if they're just remodeling their home about kind of materials to consider that are a little bit better at resisting or recovering from flood?
Yeah, we talked to them about, using tile on the floor rather than carpet or wood, and using, putting tile up the wall or using, the it's not drywall, but a cement board down it from 4 feet down, use cement board to try to keep all the water out.
Interesting.
Some houses are we have one resident that, they put concrete flooring down, so it's an easy cleanup. So if there are floodwaters, it's basically allows to come in, and then they can make a quick cleanup of it, and it's basically just floodproofing from that 4-foot elevation down with the materials that make it more resistant. It makes essentially, you're allowing the water to come in and out, and then you just clean up after that.
I want to ask you a little bit about changing neighborhoods. Lincolnville is one in particular, which is a historic Black neighborhood south of St. Augustine. Um, I mean, there was a time I recall there was a home in that neighborhood that actually was elevated on pallets, and it was an old home. It was not in great shape, and the stability of it was maybe questionable. It's no longer there. It's been replaced by one of those new, very common kind of high rise looking buildings throughout Lincolnville. What is the city doing to prevent kind of climate gentrification in that area?
So I think that neighborhood's already kind of gone through that gentrification process even before when we're really like the flooding has become more like an issue in your face type of thing. And so I think that neighborhood's kind of already gone through that process to some extent, but there's still some of that fabric that's integrity that wants to stay in the neighborhood that's been there historically. And some I think are participating in the FMA program to be able to cost share on that. We also have the Lincolnville Community Redevelopment Agency, and so that is specific for the Lincolnville neighborhood. And so there's funds that are generated that can go back for fix it up programs and rehabilitation to try to help residents where they may need some financial assistance with that. And that can include flood proofing of their houses. So that's been something that's been more recent that we've looked into.
So, just big picture, how would you say the raising of buildings fits into the overall city plan when it comes to anticipating and living with rising seas?
It's definitely a tool in the toolbox, and I think we're looking comprehensively. We have a parallel study running with the Army Corps of Engineers that's looking at all 17 neighborhoods, everything within the city limits. What alternatives and strategies do we have available to us? And non-structural is a category in that, which includes the flood proofing and the lifting of buildings. So it's definitely a tool in the toolbox, and it's already happening. And so I think we're trying to connect residents with programs such as the FMA program and other programs that are starting to come online to help with that choice, that option. There's going to be some cases where it's not an option, and so we're looking at what they call structural or nature-based solutions for that, but we are looking at it comprehensively. So I foresee it continuing because it's definitely people want to stay in their homes.
Are you anticipating some loss of funding with the new administration's priorities? I know that, some of the Biden um, projects have been stopped or are being reconsidered. Do you think that the FEMA money that's been available to do some of these partner cost sharings is going to dry up?
It's hard to say at this point. I don't
Yeah.
think we've gotten a clear clear answer on that. I think we're all, like, watching and waiting to see what happens. We haven't had any directives that I'm aware of that says, like, "This project is paused." Like, we're basically moving forward as if it's gonna happen. We're pretty far along in some of these programs that have started several years ago, and so those fundings have been allocated in prior years, and so we're hopeful that that will continue, but I think potentially the new application cycles coming online and then kind of moving forward the future programs, that is a little bit uncertain.
Yeah. Well, it is definitely something that we'll keep watching, and we sure appreciate you coming up from St. Augustine to talk about it. Jessica Beach, Buddy Schauland, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.